Okay, well, we're going to get going here, and I want to welcome everybody to the Laramie County Master Gardener Gardening for Success series, hosted by the Laramie County Master Gardeners and the University of Wyoming Laramie County Extension Office. And tonight's program is taught to us by Michelle Bohannon, and her topic is going to be on gardening hacks. So all sorts of tips for all of my master gardeners out there that are watching this. The time spent here will count towards your hour requirements. And Michelle, am I forgetting anything?
Oh, I don't think so. Looks like the sun came out on the north side of the house.
That's always encouraging. Much rather have sun than that other thing.
Yes.
So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Michelle, and she's going to lead us tonight in the program. So Michelle, take it away.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and thanks everybody for coming out. It's a lovely evening to be outside and get hit by hail or lightning or something, so I'm glad you're inside right now. I want to say I am not a master composter or anything like that, but it is something that I just kind of do habitually, and I want to kind of go through some of the quote normal type of composting that people do, what we usually think of when we do composting, and then some of the things that might not come to mind as readily most of the time. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. We'll see what happens here.
Yep, I can see it from my side, definitely.
Okay. And
now we're at your schedule.
It's my schedule.
There you go. Yep, you're busy.
Composting for busy people. Oh, yeah. Well, that's okay. Good grief. Let me figure it out.
And so while we're waiting here, that's okay, Michelle. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat box. And then as we're going along, I'll ask Michelle. And so we don't have to keep the questions to just strictly composting and soil building. So whatever comes up, go ahead and ask.
So Catherine, is it still showing my screen? Okay, stop.
Yep, no. Now we've lost your screen share.
How about now?
Yep. Back to composting. There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Well, let's just try this again. Sorry about that.
That's
so
okay.
Anyway. So in general, when we think about composting, even though it seems very mystical and scientific, and it can be as complicated as you want it to be, but it can also be as simple as you want it to be. We hear about things like browns and greens, and that sounds a little bit intimidating at first, but browns generally are those high carbon materials. Think in terms of dried out materials. So leaves, maybe 40 to 60 carbons for each nitrogen, sawdust, 325 carbons for each nitrogen in the sawdust. And then the greens are the high nitrogen materials, like your grass clippings and your coffee grounds. So when you're making your compost pile or whatever it is you're doing, you kind of try to think in terms of a ratio, a carbon-nitrogen ratio that is somewhere between 25 and 30 to 1. But if it isn't exact, not all is lost. Compost just plain happens. But if you do get too much carbon, then your pile will slow down. And if you get too much nitrogen, you end up with a stinky pile. Think in terms of a bag of grass clippings left in the sun for not very long. And that's how your compost pile might be smelling. In that case, it's just a case of mixing some browns in there and fluffing it up, introducing some oxygen, and you're back in business, usually. A little bit of water. You want your pile to be just about as moist as a wrung out sponge. And that can be tough to maintain sometimes in Wyoming. So there are various things that we do. I hate being to run a hose to water my compost pile, but we don't always get rain. Sometimes people cover their compost pile to either keep it from getting too wet or too dry. Whatever works in your situation is the best course of action. The compost needs oxygen for the microbes. Oh, I wrote oxygen to feed the microbes, but I meant for them to breathe. And space. So you can make your compost pile just in a little corner of the garden, or you can let your compost pile be the entire garden if you like. Oh, want to throw out one comment about manures. So manures will definitely heat up your compost pile, and sometimes compost piles catch on fire, not necessarily because of manure. But one thing to keep in mind is what you want to have on your garden, what you want to be breathing in or handling when you're working in your garden. So sometimes you might want to ask yourself whether or not you want to use manure. It's kind of a personal question. You kind of need to decide for yourself what is best for you. All right. And then along the lines of the typical, if you will, typical composting, when you're building your pile or filling your bin for the first time, this is how people do it properly. They have all of their material all stockpiled, and they go out on one bright sunny day and they begin layering in a compost pile. Usually most resources and people who study such things believe that a 1 cubic yard is the minimum size for a pile or a bin, and that's to make sure that it heats well enough if you're doing hot composting, or to help keep it from drying out too quickly. So if you adhere to this advice, you have all of your materials all stockpiled, and then you begin adding greens and browns in layers. Typically, I think you put the browns on the bottom, and then a layer of green, and then another layer of browns. And as you're doing this, you're adding water. It's a lot easier to water each layer than it is to fully water a cubic yard of compost, or not compost, but your compost heap all at once. It's nicer if you can do that in the layers. So now you've got all these layers built in, and then you're going to periodically turn those layers. And so no more neat layers, but what that does is it mixes the materials in, and it helps bring more nutrients to the microbes. It will incorporate more oxygen for them. You can also water at that time if necessary. And that's some work, which is okay for us. A 3-bin rotation system is the way a number of people handle that. So they've built their pile, or built their pile in their bin, and then they have 3 bins next to each other. And I have a cat here, quit helping. And they then, when they're ready to turn their pile, instead of just turning it in place, they take their pile from bin number 1 and fork it over into bin number 2, and then they're ready to start adding new material to the first bin. And then later they can put their pile in bin number 2 into bin number 3 for it to finish cooking, if you will. And that depends on the climate and how long that takes at the moisture that you get. Some people can have compost in a number of weeks, like 6 or 8 weeks. That person wouldn't be me. Usually it's going to take a little bit longer. If it's cold, if the temperatures are down, it takes a lot longer because the microbes slow down. It takes longer, of course, if there's not as much moisture and the compost dries out, the pile dries out. And it takes longer if you're not able to turn the pile very well. But in the end, almost always compost comes out the other side. If the pile gets too dry, it won't work as well, but when it gets moistened up again, it'll go back to work for you. Something to keep in mind is when the materials are active and they're heating, and they'll be 130 degrees, 160 degrees. Like I said, sometimes compost heaps catch fire, which you don't really want that to happen. But while the microbes are breaking down the material, they're using nitrogen. So when you put unfinished compost onto your beds, your garden beds or your flower beds, you can do a couple different things. If it's too hot and you put it on fairly thickly, or if you put it down next to the plant's roots, you can actually physically burn your plants with unfinished compost as the microbes heat that compost back up. The other thing, which is usually a short-term problem, is the nitrogen will be tied up and unavailable for the plants until the composting process is finished. But that's why people let their compost finish or cure, but many of us can't wait that long, and so we just have to be a little more careful about applying it and not burning our plants with unfinished compost. So if you're not using a pile, you can, or you don't have space for a pile, you can use a tumbler. They're quick and easy. They're fairly neat. They're not nearly as messy looking as a compost bin. They're also pretty small. I don't know if everyone's like me in that there's never enough compost in the world to suit me. But a tumbler is nice, and this is one that we have in the backyard, and I like it when I have something that I don't really want the raccoons or the dog or the stray cats or something like that to get into. I do forget to water it, but it is easy to turn it. You just spin the tumbler around, and this is a kind of a small one. So there are bigger ones, but then you're running into how much you're able to tumble by yourself and whether or not you want it up on a stand. And then, okay, got a little video of the leaves in the leaf corral and how the leaf compost will look after they've been sitting in the leaf corral. And what I do is in the fall of the year when the city does its leaf pickup, then I like to go out and see if I can get more leaves than the city. I can't, but it's still fun to pretend. So a lot of times I'll bring home a couple hundred bags of leaves if I can get them. And sometimes you want to be selective about not getting leaves out of a yard that has 6 great big dogs in it. You might get a lot more than leaves, and you still will get a lot more than leaves. But one time I got a pruning saw, and that was a pretty good find. Another time I got a pot pipe, and that wasn't all that helpful. So you'll always get a surprise. A nicer surprise in your leaves are these bumble flower beetles. And here's some pictures of some grubs from the leaf corral. And I think you may have had a program on these guys here a while back, but they just turn into kind of brown, large brown flying beetles that visit the flowers in their adult phase. But when they're grubs, they are busy munching down the leaves and helping decompose it. And what I do with the leaf corral is I do take the leaves out of the bags. You don't really have to, because it is easier to move those decomposed leaves when they're still in the bag. You can actually just kind of reach into the pile if you've accidentally left them in the bag. And it's kind of like hauling a wet bunch of leaf compost out in a deflated balloon. But it's pretty easy to move those around the yard and put them where you want them. Otherwise, you're digging the leaf compost out, putting it in a bucket or a wheelbarrow or whatever, and carrying it around that way, which is fine too. But I really do like leaf compost, and I like competing with the city. They always win, of course. But you can overdo it also. I have incorporated a little more leaf compost than is probably necessary. And now I have to battle the roly-polies, and that's another problem. So when they decide they're going to eat all of my pepper plants, I'm not all that happy with the roly-polies. But leaf compost is a wonderful thing. And then kind of moving to something different from the typical, if you will, composting, where you put things in a pile or a bin and then come back and harvest it later. There's the soil building by composting in place. And this is the part that I like for myself, because while it suits my nature to be fussy, I don't have enough time to be fussy. And so if the compost can take care of making itself where I want to use it, then that's all the better. So I've done it a couple different ways. On the surface, I haven't done true lasagna, but the concept of lasagna gardening is one that is a nice one to explore. I think it's hard to keep it moist enough. Hügelkultur, I like that idea. And then the in-ground in bins or trenches or holes. So here is a picture of what's left after I put a few hundred bags of leaves on a particular garden row in a hoop house and left them over that winter and the spring. And this picture may have been taken in the fall, I can't quite remember. But you can see that 2 to 3 feet of leaves by the end of a few seasons had broken down to, I'm not sure what that is, maybe 6 inches of organic leaf compost, if you will. And then you can kind of see the demarcation between the leaf compost and what is supposed to be my garden soil. So a lot more structure there, and the plants seem to enjoy that as well, along with the roly-polies, but I'm dealing with those in a different way. Oh, keeping the leaves moist enough. Yes, that is important. Otherwise, you'll just have dry leaves in your hoop house if that's where you're doing it forever. Leaves on the ground, they naturally are going to decompose. If they don't blow away on you, it's nice if you can run them over with a lawnmower and put them where you want them. They're less likely to blow away on you. And they're really nice when they break down in the flower bed all winter long and feed your flower bed, or your garden beds for that matter, all the next season. So we've all kind of heard of lasagna gardening, and it can be tough if we don't get enough rain to keep a vast new lasagna garden moistened enough. We end up with dried out bits of cardboard, bits of dry grass and newspaper or whatever, and maybe it escapes and it blows all over the yard. If you can keep it moist enough, there's a chance that you would be able to plant right directly into the lasagna garden you built come spring, into the garden that you built last fall. I don't have any personal knowledge if it truly, truly can smother a lawn without doing something to the lawn before that. And again, a lot of material I think you would need to build much of a lasagna bed. Maybe people restrict themselves to just their materials on hand, and that's always helpful. But if you can build your lasagna bed 12 inches, 24 inches, that will probably result in a nice long-term bed for your ornamentals or your garden or whatever it is you're doing. But again, getting it moist enough in the first place, keeping it moist enough, and not having it escape and blow all over the yard and the neighborhood can be tough. I do think it's worth working on if this is the kind of gardening you want to do. It just be ready to get creative on keeping your lasagna garden under wraps. Now, Hügelkultur is quite exciting to me, even though I haven't done a big tall mound, I've done more of the in-ground Hügelkulturs that we'll talk about here in a minute. But generally, what a person does is excavate the first, say, 12 inches or so of the bed, and deeper is fine too, and buries fairly good sized logs, whatever you have. And the thing that I've noticed around my yard is when I'm getting ready to build some kind of a new bed, I always think I have more than enough material on hand. And by the time I get my bed halfway done, I'm out of material and I'm scrounging for more. So it seems that if you run out of logs and good sized branches, then the same thing goes for a regular mound culture as goes for what I do on my trench hugels, if you will. And I use cardboard, newspaper, corn stalks, weed stalks, anything left over from the prior season, all the coffee grounds that I may have accumulated from the office. And you see a lot of fanciful pictures of people gardening on a hugel, where they're just kind of going along as though they're going down the aisles of the grocery store and picking radishes and carrots. I'm not quite sure that that is exactly how it will work out in real life, but this is a nice long-term garden, soil building garden for things that we can do here in Wyoming. The thing that I noticed when I was looking for a picture of the general layout of a hugel was people are getting creative, and they're not just making lines of Hügelkulturs, they're making what looks like what the mound builders, I think they were Native American mound builders, were doing. So they've made, on a much smaller scale, they've made these serpentine hugels in their yard. So they've made quite a bit of yard interest, which I thought that was kind of interesting. It made me think that I should have tried that. Then here's an in-ground compost bin. And the idea for me was from my friend who came back from Kenya, and was when I was looking at some of the things that they were doing, one of the things was these keyhole gardens, and they will put a compost bin, an in-ground compost bin, in a keyhole garden, meaning kind of maybe a circular garden or a square garden with a slot, so that you can walk up to the compost bin without walking through the garden itself. And then they tip all of their organic material into the in-ground compost bin, and they water that too. And then that in turn feeds their bed. And I thought that was quite interesting. So I thought I'll go ahead and dig a hole in my hoop house, 2 holes in my hoop house, and try that out. I do like it. It's really handy in the wintertime when I don't feel like messing around with other places to dump my compost. It's pretty easy to walk into the hoop house and dump my compost bin into these bins here in the hoop house. It is easy also to let them dry out. So then you have quite a project on your hand on getting them remoistened, which is the project I have right now that I'm working on. And just pretty much like all compost bins, the mice think compost is wonderful, and so they figure you've set out a smorgasbord for them. So hopefully the stray cat comes by and helps you out with that. And I guess I called in a cat by saying that, but we'll see if she stays put. And here's more in-ground composting. I really like digging trenches, not with a trowel. I'm trying to show how that soil looks in the top part of a trench after I built an in-ground Hügel out of the trench. Quit rubbing on that. So I really think that this is a wonderful place to use up all of those materials that are left in your yard, either from the tree branches coming down or the sunflower seed stalks that take a long time to break down above ground. Same with the hollyhocks and any of those coarse dry stalks. They make a wonderful base for a new bed. And they do sink down over time, depending on how full you were able to get them. But they are wonderful for a water bank. And some of my best beds are the ones that I went ahead and took the time to either dig a trench, or if I was just building a bed and hedging it, make the whole base of it out of whatever organic material, garden trash I had hanging around in the garden. And it kind of brings us to the last thing I want to talk about, and that is something a little bit strange and that I've been trying for the last few years. I'm not a great lawn person. I try to do better, but I also am not crazy about putting a lot of water on the lawn. And so the lawn gets smaller and smaller as I take it over year after year. But I have been just digging little circular holes in the lawn and adding mulch or leaves, or in this case, buckets of coffee grounds into these test holes. And then you just flip the sod plug back on top of the lawn, or back on top of the compost, or whatever, not compost, but whatever you've thrown in the bottom of the hole. And it's a good idea to water it up to help the lawn heal back up quickly. You can kind of see in that little middle picture, it's not that the lawn is greener, I just took that with a different camera that turns everything much greener than it is. And it'll take a little while for that plug to settle down. It's only sitting up a couple inches. But in the spring of the year, you can kind of see where the test holes are. And then when because they get kind of light green if we've had a lot of of rain or something. It's kind of washy looking. But then later in the season, when I'm really tired of pouring water on the lawn and I can't even keep up with it, these areas where I've dug these test holes, they stay green the longest. Now, a couple of years ago, we had a really, really dry, hot, dry summer. And eventually the test holes also turned brown, but they were the very last to go dormant on me. And they were also the first to green back up in the spring. So if I were ever doing a lawn again, I might be tempted to make the base of my lawn, I don't know, wood chips, mulch, something like that. However, it's one of those things that kind of like the, what is it, the red plastic that's supposed to help your tomatoes ripen faster or something like that. Most of the catalogs say, just try this on a limited basis or trial this on a limited basis to see if it works for you. So probably that's all I'm going to continue to do. I'm not really recommending that someone build a lawn on top of mulch. It might not work, but it's been working pretty well for me so far. So that's kind of what I have. I just wanted to kick out a few different kind of ideas, and then maybe we can have a discussion of composting or other things among ourselves for the rest of the time. Oh, I wonder if we lost.
Yeah.
Oh no, there's Catherine. Okay.
Yeah, that was great. That was, you have some really cool ideas about building the soil. Have you ever had any of the soil tested after you do that to see where you're at?
No, you know, I haven't done it on the lawn, and I've thought about it, and I really, really should. Now, the soil tests that I've done on the garden were when I did get carried away. And so I have all of the potassium and phosphorus I will ever need. I'm always short on nitrogen. That's the only thing I ever need to add to the, you're gonna get a shot there. That's the only thing I've ever had to add to the garden anymore is nitrogen. I'm never going to ever run out, I don't think, of the other two. So I don't need the 10-10-10 or something like that. And of course, the organic material or organic matter percentage is always much, much higher in the garden area than anywhere else.
Do you ever see any nitrogen type deficiencies other than just sort of a yellowing on any of your plants?
Yeah, just on the lawn. That's the only place that I've seen that. I did mess up last year on and the peppers, one side of the melon hoop, one side of the where the peppers go. I don't know what I was thinking, but I dumped a bunch of coffee grounds, and then I noticed that the peppers on one side of the melon hoop were growing and the other peppers were not. And so I like I say, I save coffee grounds at work, so I probably had several buckets of coffee grounds over there. So there you do see that nitrogen deficiency. It didn't show up so much on the peppers as yellow leaves as just simply sitting there and not growing. And it was a great bad experiment because, like I said, one side of the melon hoop was growing, the other side wasn't.
So most of your vegetables like a low nitrogen anyway and like acidic soils. So I would think that they would have appreciated the coffee grounds, but maybe it was just too much coffee grounds.
Yeah, that goes under the overdo it category. Oh, thank you. So it's nice if you don't overdo it, but that's my middle name.
Well, that's okay. You probably have one of the best amended yards in Cheyenne as far as growing things. And if anyone out there's got some questions, you know, we don't have to keep it to soils or composting. Any sort of gardening question is welcome. And again, you can put it in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask the question. And so you mentioned you don't like to use manures, or you're apprehensive of manures. And would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I'm not the expert, and I should say that it's supper time here. I should say that I have used manures in the past, and I grew up on a ranch, and so naturally we always used, you know, we spread the manures on from the corral or the barn or whatever out on the pastures or the hay meadow or wherever you were going. And there was always a scoop of manure set on the edge of the garden to sit and do its thing for a few years to compost on its own, and then you dig into that and incorporate a little bit here and there. The thing about manures is they're different depending on your source. And I don't just mean the animal source. I'm thinking too about the manure coming from a feedlot, a dairy feedlot or a beef feedlot is what I call juiced, because the rations that are being fed to the animals are way high in the nutrients. And so just like when you take your one-a-day vitamin in the morning, you might notice that what you didn't need, you excreted a little later that morning. So that's what the animals in the feedlot are eating all day long, and it's meant to keep them healthy. But that also means that the manure from a feedlot is going to be so much saltier and so much higher in other various things than the manure just from the cows that happen to be up at the manger in the corral, all, you know, on and off during the winter or summer. So, and I have used manure, but I also have had a soil test done where my EC ratio was pretty high and the carrots were not happy with me. So it's easy to overdo it with manures, where you might, on your first application of plant-based compost, you might get away with 1 inch or 2 inches across the top on the first. You don't want to do that every single time, but you might get away with a couple inch layer the first time. With manure-based, you want to cut that down to, I don't know, something like 1/4 inch. It's so much more concentrated, and it's so easy to overdo things. Plus, there's as things dry out over the summer, things become airborne. You never know what you're breathing in. Sometimes you might not be all that thrilled about eating the carrot that you grew in the garden that you overdid the manure application on. So just things to think about, and there's all kinds of plant-based material if you don't want to do the manure.
And Michelle, could you just put the manure into your compost bin and leave it there for a year?
And you can do that. The manures will bring the salt content up, the EC ratio up. And if you can do it in moderation, if you are one of those people who is able to control yourself, and that doesn't include me, if you're able to do it in moderation, people have done it throughout the ages. And the thing is hot composting, which can be hard to sustain if we're not paying close attention, is supposed to destroy those pathogens, but there's always the edges of the compost pile that aren't getting hot. So the center of your compost pile might be 160 degrees, and that's great. And as you turn it, hopefully you're incorporating that. But if there happened to be a very bad pathogen, I don't know what it might be, but you it's just something to think about as well. I've used manures, my whole family uses manures, but it's a calculated risk. So then you just ask yourself what risk you want to take. I don't use manure anymore, but.
Yeah, so some of the problems I have with manures are just like what Michelle's talking about. And, you know, I live on a ranch. Michelle grew up on a ranch. And so both of us are used to the pathogens that come from cattle. And, you know, so our immune system has kind of developed a little bit of immunity to that. But most people who haven't been around cattle in any meaningful time frame have what's referred to as a naive immune system, where it's not been introduced to those pathogens, and those pathogens are E. coli and listeriosis and campylobacter, and there's a whole alphabet soup of those things. So that's why we have some caution on that, because as Michelle mentioned, the center of the compost pile may get really hot and kill off those pathogens, but the outer edges may not. And if you turn it and re-inoculate the pile with those pathogens and then use it in your vegetable garden, you really risk ingesting some of that, whether you inhale it or eat it. And I'm notorious for going through my own garden and grazing, and that's breakfast. You know, eat a couple tomatoes here, pull a carrot, wash the, you know, I don't even wash it, I just wipe the dirt off and eat it. And so for better or for worse, you know, that's kind of how geeky plant people are. We run around town getting bags of leaves, or we just graze right directly from our garden. So a lot of caution there. And Michelle was talking about the EC, so everybody here who's a master gardener should know what EC means and the consequences of that. And then the other thing is horse manure. I see ads in the traders every year for free, come get it, horse manure. You will inoculate your garden with more weed seeds than you even knew existed. And it's just a mess, just a monster to try to get rid of those weeds, if you ever get rid of them. And if that horse has been eating bindweed, that bindweed just goes straight through a horse, those bindweed seeds. And horses are bad, just really poor digesters. They don't even have what's called a true stomach. And so their digestive is just pretty, they're called hay burners for a reason, right? and so I just caution to using manures between the pathogens and the EC that always has me very concerned. And and so for everyone here who's a master gardener, you know, part of your job is to help beginner gardeners, and we have a lot of those this year, a lot. The seed companies were practically selling out or sold out of their seeds. And so we've got a lot of beginners out there, and so any way we can help them not fail is important. Michelle, what else? And again, anyone with questions or comments?
So I see a couple there.
Yeah. So Michelle, how often do you turn your compost pile?
So when I used to actually make a compost pile, I was doing it in the ash pit. Remember the ash pits? That was our garbage disposal system in town. And so we still have an ash pit. We don't set it on fire. But and that turned out to be a little bit difficult to turn. But the way the proper way to do it, as I understand, is you monitor the temperatures, and then when they reach, say, whatever you've decided, 150 degrees, 160 degrees, you turn it. Now, how often you turn it changes based on where the decomposition, where they are in the decomposition process for that particular pile, where where you are in that pile. So when you first build a pile, it takes a few days to heat up, depending on what you've used. And then a few days might be 3 days, or it might be 7 days or 10 days. Kind of depends on the greens that you've added. If there's a lot of greens in there, it's going to heat up much more quickly. And than if there's a lot of browns. But what people say is, okay, we monitor the temperature, and when it hits 160 degrees, we turn it, and it'll cool off for just a little while, and then almost immediately, within a day or two, start heating again. And then you turn it again once it hits that magic number that you've chosen, 150, 140, 160 degrees, whatever it is. And then you'll notice that with each turning, the temperatures don't go as high as, say, the time before, as time goes on. And also you'll notice that your 3-foot pile is now much, much smaller as it's being consumed. And then people then might go to turning it every week, every month, something like that. So it's however you've decided to operate your compost heap. But those are some of the guidelines that people do use.
Okay, so a couple more questions here, Michelle. And do you ever add worms to your compost pile?
So not to the compost pile, it's too warm in there for worms to survive in the compost pile itself, because they like it cooler. They're liking it around 50-ish degrees, not 160 degrees. But what they will do is they will come to your compost pile as it's cooling off, and they'll work on finishing the process for you. And one time I had a visitor from work in my yard, and I happened to have been dumping coffee grounds in a particular flower bed, and I think I just had a little light covering of soil. And since they were just, I don't know, maybe gallon buckets of coffee grounds in any one little area, that doesn't heat up a lot. But my friend was asking, what do you do with all the coffee grounds? and we just happened to be standing there, so I just kicked the top of the dirt off of where I knew that I had dumped a bucket of coffee grounds a few weeks before. And my friend just jumped back and said, oh my gosh, because it was just crawling with worms, because they sniffed it out and they like that sort of thing. But it was actually even a little much for me, because they really were crawling through the coffee grounds. So they will, if you start making compost, they will come. Even if you're composting in a tumbler and it's not in contact with the ground, oftentimes there will be worm eggs laid on, if you put leaves or grass or something in there, the worms will have laid eggs along there, and you end up with worms in there if it's not been hot enough to kill them off.
So another question, Michelle, is, does rabbit poop count as the kind of manure you are discussing? Little rabbit pellets.
And and that's where I didn't grow up, I had a few rabbits, but I didn't grow up surrounded by bunnies growing up. But so rabbit poop is considered, if you're into using manure, is something that people claim they really like to use. In fact, some people will keep rabbits just for the poop. But I think you have to keep it separate from the urine, or it gets way, way salty. But it's a manure, and I don't know what sorts of pathogens you might run into with the bunny poo. It's a manure. Use your best judgment again.
Yeah, I'm not sure what sort of pathogens you'd run into either. I know that the wild rabbits can carry tularemia, but I don't know about the domestic ones. And my caution would be on the salts, just like you mentioned, is, that's a pretty concentrated pile underneath a rabbit cage, and that can be toxic if you add too much, and a little goes a long ways, as always. And so what are the best sources here for bulk compost and planting mixes for raised beds? And for bulk compost, the city compost, last year we did a tour, the Advanced Master Gardeners, and I did a tour of the city compost facility, which I thought, my initial thought was, really? But it was actually very fascinating. A geeky plant person would say the compost facility is very fascinating. But you got to be careful again with a little compost goes a long ways. And, you know, if there's manures in it, it's going to be salty. Half an inch, rototill it in, caution, caution, caution on it. And in planting mix for raised beds, the city also has bulk topsoil where they haven't added compost to it. And so that's pretty good. And of course, the Laramie County Master Gardeners, if you go to lcmg.org, they have a potting soil, bag soil sale, and they do a lot of research on what is the best. And you can buy very good quality bag soil from the Master Gardeners. So Michelle, another question for you. Do you put worms right into your garden bed?
So, yeah, that's a great question, because you see like worm egg cases for sale in some of the catalogs. And I don't have to is the answer. So I don't, but I don't have I mean, it's not a bad thing to do if you don't have any, but it seems to me they've got some incredible noses on them. I don't know how they sniff things out, but anytime that I've incorporated leaves or whatever, coffee grounds into the soil, under the soil, then I get to the point where I'm kind of afraid to dig because I don't really like chopping them in half. So it's a case of if you add the organic material, they will come, because that is what they're eating, is the organic material. And in fact, I love listening on a very still day, which we don't get, and certainly not today, but every so often on a very still day, I will be just watching a leaf on the surface of the soil moving, and I can hear it also. Usually I'll hear it, and then I'll see it. And what is going on is it's probably a night crawler under there. And what he's done is they're tunnels that they make, they're permanent burrows until I dig them up and disturb them. But they come up, and he's pulling that down to his burrow to stockpile it. And it's amazing to just kind of sit there and listen and watch that happening. It's just one of the, you know, the secret lives of worms that you get to see when you have a moment in your garden.
They actually did a research project on just that very thing.
Really?
And they measured the amount of leaf litter on the surface, soil surface, and then 6 months later they measured it again, and 6 months later they measured it again, and the worms were pulling it back down into the earth. And so, yeah, so very cool. Very cool that you got to watch that or hear that. So it's very cool. Yep. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Again, you can unmute yourself and ask a question, and see if we can stump Michelle or stump me. So you're.
What do you do to get rid of bindweed? Bindweed.
Don't have it in the first place is the only thing I know. But
well, when we moved into our house, the house had been vacant for 2 years. And there was one bed there that had a carpet of bindweed. I've got rid of most of it, but every now and again I see some little thing creeping up.
and the birds gift it to you too, even after have eradicated it or mostly eradicated it, then they'll come back. I've heard, but I haven't had this problem, that toward the fall of the year, when the plants are drawing the nutrients back into that great big root that they use for storage for overwintering, that is, if you're going to use some kind of a pesticide on them, that could be the time. but I'm lucky that I don't have bindweed except when the birds give it to me and I get after it. But I don't know personally how to get rid of it. And I bet Catherine has fielded this question once before.
Yeah, so bindweed is any of those really deep rhizomatous type perennial weeds. It's just a game of persistence. And so you just have to stay on top of it. And I will take a paintbrush and dip the paintbrush into Roundup and just paint the Roundup right onto the plant. And so it's very precise, targeted herbicide at that point. And I'm not broadcasting it. I'm just really going straight for it. And it's just really a game of persistence. And I think the worst bindweed patch in Cheyenne is over at Cheyenne Alliance Church off of Ridge and Del Range. And the bindweed is literally, there's a side street going to the church, and the bindweed is literally pushing the asphalt up. And it goes under the road into one property and then over to the church, and that it's just, so count your blessings, I guess. But it's just persistence, just pure persistence. And then another question we've got is, what fertilizers do you recommend? Well, if you're compost, like what Michelle has been talking about tonight, then you really don't need a fertilizer. The compost will do it. You're feeding the soil, and that's the whole premise with that, is to feed the soil. The soil feeds the plant. But Michelle, do you want to answer that or add to that at all?
Well, I'm a bad fertilizer person, and I'm always doing something wrong. So I do like using the compost, but I do need just a little bit of nitrogen in the garden. And I don't think I have a particular favorite brand of nitrogen. And I have to say that I do put nitrogen on the lawn once a year now, and it does better. Even though I leave all the grass clippings on the lawn, it does seem to appreciate a little bit of nitrogen. So I think Catherine taught us let's see, alfalfa pellets and molasses recipe that I have to look up. I do actually like the alfalfa pellets, but I do have to put them in a bucket and get them mushy, because otherwise the bunnies will take off and they think that this is where they should live. So I don't always do the molasses. I probably don't remember the proper ratio, but I think Catherine will tell us. But I do like the alfalfa pellets for the nitrogen.
So the fertilizer that I teach at the Master Gardener program, and I got enough Master Gardeners on here, you guys should all just chime in and tell everybody, but it's 1 pound of alfalfa pellets, and it's the horse alfalfa pellets. Make sure you don't get the rabbit ones, because the rabbit ones get salt in it. And you soak it in a 5-gallon bucket of water. So 1 pound of alfalfa pellets in a 5-gallon bucket of water. And you soak that 8-12 hours. You don't want to go more than 24 because it starts to ferment and smells kind of nasty. And the alfalfa will either float to the top or it'll fall to the bottom. Kind of an amber green, amber brown colored solution. And that depends upon the alfalfa, stage of alfalfa, when they ground it and pelletized it. And then the person who developed this recipe has kind of tweaked it a little bit, and she's backed off. It was Dr. Elaine Ingham from Oregon State University. And she now is using just corn syrup, which is cheaper and a lot cheaper, and it's easier to find. You can go to the dollar store and buy it for $1. And so when you're ready to use the solution, the tea, the alfalfa tea, you put in a pint of corn syrup and stir it up, and you can add a couple tablespoons of fish emulsion to kind of push that nitrogen level a little bit higher. And then I just feed it to my plants, 1 cup per plant once a week. And it's just very benign. And it's also kind of a modified recipe that the American Hosta and the American Iris Societies use on their plants. And you can take the mush, the alfalfa pellet mush, and compost it, or you can add it as a ground cover. It gets hard, it's kind of interesting, or you can just stir it directly into your soil. You can use it as a lawn fertilizer, feed your trees. It's a multitasker in my book. Not very expensive. It's around $11.50 for a 50-pound bag. So, yeah.
This is Shauna, and I've been using that recipe of yours, Catherine.
Yeah.
And I have to give kudos to you for sharing that. It's been wonderful. And it's cheap and it's natural, like you said, and I swear my tomatoes taste sweeter.
Good. That's good. That's
And
excellent to hear.
is there any drawbacks to using the mush? Because I've been throwing it out, and I'm been racking my brain. What would happen if you spread it over a certain area in your garden or on your lawn? Is there any specific drawbacks we should be looking for? Maybe we're using too much, or
No, I think you're good. I think you'd be fine. And I just add it back to the soil in my vegetable garden. I'm on sandy loam and it needs all the help I can get. So you're not going to hurt anything using it as a like a ground cover, mulch. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So it is 7:34, and any other questions? Michelle, I want to thank you for taking an hour out of your evening and putting that program together for us, and learned a lot about all the different methods of composting and some cool things to do and easy ways to do it. And again, any other questions? If not, we'll end the evening. And next week on the 26th of May, that's a Tuesday, so a little different day, Kathy Shreve, Master Gardener Kathy Shreve will be on, and we'll be doing a program on raised beds and container gardening. So you're welcome to join us. And again, I will send out the Zoom link, and you can certainly share it with family and friends and neighbors and whoever. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for coming out and spending an evening with us. And Michelle, again, I want to thank you for a great program and sharing your knowledge with us. So with that.
Oh, Catherine, do you know anything about millstone for bindweed?
For milestone on bindweed, I would have to read the label. And so this is an herbicide that you've got to go through Laramie County Weed and Pest to get. And milestone is usually mixed with another herbicide, and it's something that we use on Dalmatian toadflax. But I'd have to read the label because off top I don't know. Bindweed is a tough customer, really tough. And if it's in your garden, it's in my garden, I just paint a little Roundup on it and I call it good. I know Roundup's got a really bad name and bad rap, but if you're careful, you read the label because the label is the law. You'll be good. The media, love the media. So anyway.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine.
Yeah, Michelle, thanks.
Everyone have a nice evening.
Yeah, have a nice evening. It's raining out here. I left the windows open in the house, so that's why it's raining.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.